Do we worship God, or do we worship power disguised as God? Would you still love God if He had no power to bless you, punish you, or even save you? Would you still pray if there were no miracles, no heaven, and no hell? Strip away the miracles and punishments, the afterlife rewards. Would God still be God if He had no power? When we look at history, theology, and philosophy, especially in how different cultures define divinity, the answer isn't so simple, but it might be the most important question we've forgotten to ask. Let's look at one side of the world first before shifting our focus to India. In this part of the world, there was a time when access to God wasn't something you could claim for yourself. You needed permission, and that permission came through the church. Over time, especially in medieval Europe, the Christian Church positioned itself as the sole gatekeeper of salvation. If you wanted to be saved, you had to go through the proper channels: priests, confession, and sacraments. And most of all, obedience. But this idea didn't stay inside the church walls. It shaped the very structure of society. Kings ruled by divine right, claiming their authority directly from God. Disobeying the king then became a spiritual offense. Disobeying the church, that was even worse. And so, the image of God shifted from a loving creator to a distant monarch, one who watched constantly and one whose favor could be lost. The church enforced this image through powerful tools, such as the Inquisition, which hunted down heretics, excommunication, which cut people off not only from the church, but from their family, and perhaps, most powerful of all, the fear of hell. Preachers gave sermons not about love or mercy, but about endless fires and torment for those who strayed. The French philosopher Michel Foucault wrote about this kind of power. He explained how institutions like the church and the state learned to control people, not through violence alone, but by shaping how they think and feel about themselves. In his book, Discipline and Punish, he showed how confession, something that was deeply personal, was turned into a method of surveillance. People internalized guilt. They learned to monitor themselves, to fear their own desires, their own doubts. The church no longer needed to punish everyone, because people punished themselves. Even the afterlife became a system of control. Historian Jacques Le Goff wrote about how the church introduced the idea of purgatory, a kind of spiritual waiting room where souls could be purified through suffering. The more you paid the church, the more prayers were said for your soul and the shorter your stay. And so suffering became something to pay your way out of. And through it all, God was portrayed as the ultimate judge, a kind of cosmic king who demanded loyalty, not closeness, not love, just fear, submission, and obedience. And so through it all, it is not a surprise that the question in people's mind arises: was this truly God, or was it about control? Do we worship the divine or the power that claims to speak in its name? And maybe this is a residue of a culture that so often conflates authority with divinity, where to revere is to obey, to question is to rebel, and to fear is to somehow prove faith. When we look at the world around us, at history and historical texts, notice how often our concept of God mirrors the kings and rulers we've often feared: omnipotent, distant, and prone to wrath. Is this reverence or submission? Is it love, or is it simply survival? But even in India, rituals hardened into rules. Access to certain rituals, knowledge like the Vedas, and temples were restricted by caste and gender. Priests were seen as intermediaries, and the idea that you couldn't access the divine without them gave power to a specific class, all in the name of God. But that was never Sanatan Dharma. And why this happened and what went wrong is a story for another time. So east or west, the question remains: when we bow, do we bow out of love or out of fear? Do we seek the divine or just the comfort of control? But now, if we shift our gaze eastward, towards Bharat, the story changes. In India, especially in Vedanta, in the philosophy of Advaita, God isn't a king or a judge. There's no one watching from above. Instead, there's this idea that the divine is not separate from you at all. It's not out there, It's you, your own awareness, your own consciousness. There is no king to obey, but a self to remember. You are not a subject in God's kingdom, you are God remembering yourself. And this isn't arrogance, this is union. From the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and so I say again, no, I do not fear God, I belong to Him, or rather, there is no Him, no me, only this. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad puts it with unmatched simplicity. It also says, when there is duality, one sees another, but when everything is one, who sees what? It's a simple idea, but a radical one. If you and God aren't two different things, then who's left to fear who? If there's no separation, then no judgment, no external authority to submit to. There's just awareness. There's just being, and that's the shift. From fear to recognition, that changes everything. Relativity exists only when there are two, the observer and the observed. But when one merges into universal consciousness, there is no second, no duality. What remains is the absolute truth, a boundless ocean of bliss, where you are not a separate drop, but the entire sea. That is Advaita, the non-dual reality where the game of comparison, reaction, and karma ends. The journey of the soul reaches its final destination when the separation dissolves. You become a Jivan Mukta, free while alive, beyond the cycles of birth and death. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky asks, if God is good, then why does he allow the suffering of a child? Can love that demands blind obedience still be love? It was also famously declared that God is dead, but what he really grieved was not God, it was how we had turned God into an idol of control, used to justify domination. We are taught to love God, but also to fear Him. But can those two coexist without distorting one another? Even our language betrays us. We say God-fearing as a compliment. We imagine hell more vividly than we can imagine grace. So let's go back to the Bhagavad Gita, one of the most influential spiritual texts ever written, and also one of the most misunderstood, because the Gita starts in a very different place than people expect. It doesn't begin with an enlightened sage sitting calmly delivering divine wisdom. It begins with a breakdown. Arjuna, a warrior, a prince, is standing in the middle of a battlefield, and he completely falls apart. His hands are shaking, his bow drops. He says, what's the point of this? Why fight? Why kill? What even is the right thing to do anymore? Even if I were to win a kingdom, or even rule over the gods, I don't want it. And then he says something even more honest. He says, I'm lost, my dharma is confused, I don't know what to do. And that is how the Gita begins, not with strength, but with fear, doubt, and honest questioning. Arjuna is not worshipping power, he is overwhelmed by it. And Krishna, who we later learn is divine, doesn't shame him for it, he doesn't say, obey. He says, let's talk. Because Krishna isn't just a god in the sky, he's something much more. He says, Aham Atmam, I am the self, seated in the hearts of all beings. Krishna isn't asking Arjuna to fear him. He's reminding him, you are not separate from me. The same consciousness that runs through the universe runs through you. I am not out here judging you. I'm in here, waiting to be remembered. And later, when Arjuna asks, who's the best devotee? Krishna doesn't say, the one who fears me the most. He says, the one who is kind, who lets go of ego, and is steady in pain and pleasure. That person is dear to me. In the Gita, devotion is about sincerity, letting go of ego, not to be dominated, but to remember who you truly are. The highest devotion is never about worshipping power. So when we ask, do we worship God or do we worship power? The Gita flips the whole question. It says, if you think God is just power, you've misunderstood both. You see, the divine doesn't seek control, but connection, because Bhagavan isn't separate from us. There is only the act of remembering, and so in remembrance, devotion becomes natural, not out of fear, not out of need, but out of recognition. I'd love to hear what you think. How do you experience God or divinity? Namaste.